At dinner, my brother smirked. You only bought that house because mom and dad helped you, so you should let me move in. Dad nodded. He's right. You should help family. Mom added, it's the least you can do. I put down my fork and said, if that's how you all feel, don't expect me to keep helping you anymore. They started panicking sooner than I expected. I, 32M, sat at my parents' dining table last Tuesday, watching my brother shovel mashed potatoes into his mouth like he hadn't eaten in days. The chandelier above us, the one I'd helped them install 2 years ago when Dad's back gave out, cast warm light across faces I'd known my entire life. Mom had made pot roast, the same recipe she'd been perfecting since I was 8. Everything felt normal until my brother opened his mouth. He said I only bought my house because mom and dad helped me, so I should let him move in. Just like that. Fork halfway to his mouth, smirking like he'd just delivered the world's greatest punchline. My hand froze over my plate. Dad nodded slowly, saying my brother was right and I should help family. Mom chimed in immediately, adding it was the least I could do after everything they'd done for me. Her voice had that particular edge I remembered from childhood, the one that made disagreement feel like betrayal. I set down my fork carefully, the metal clinking against the porcelain louder than it should have been. I told them if that was how they all felt, they shouldn't expect me to keep helping them anymore. The words came out calmer than I felt. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice stayed steady. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Mom's face went pale. Dad's fork clattered to his plate. My brother's smirk vanished like someone had flipped a switch. Let me back up. 6 years ago, I graduated college with a degree in computer engineering and $60,000 in student loans. Mom and Dad had helped with school, about $15,000 total over 4 years. I'd worked 2 jobs, taken out loans, and scraped by on ramen and pride. I was grateful for their help. I told them so dozens of times. My brother, 3 years younger, had dropped out of college after 1 semester. Said it wasn't for him. Fair enough. Not everyone needs a degree. But while I was building a career in software development, he was bouncing between jobs like a pinball. Restaurant server, warehouse worker, retail associate, delivery driver. Nothing stuck. Nothing was ever good enough. The boss was always terrible. The customers were always awful. The pay was always insulting. I bought my house 4 years ago. Saved for the down payment myself, every penny. Well, almost every penny. Mom and Dad had given me $5,000 as a housewarming gift. $5,000 toward a $30,000 down payment on a $250,000 house. I'd covered the rest through years of budgeting, side projects, and living in a studio apartment that smelled like the fish market downstairs. I'd thanked them profusely, sent flowers, took them to dinner. That $5,000 had helped, absolutely. But it wasn't the reason I owned a house. The reason was 6 years of 70-hour weeks, skipped vacations, and saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to things I needed. My brother still lived in an apartment he could barely afford, working part-time at a coffee shop and part-time driving for a rideshare app. He was always broke, always complaining, always looking for the next big opportunity that would fix everything without requiring actual sustained effort. Which brought us to Tuesday night. Mom started talking fast, saying I was being dramatic and they were just trying to help my brother get on his feet. Dad said I was taking this the wrong way. They weren't demanding anything, just suggesting I be generous. My brother sat there looking between them like a tennis match spectator, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. I asked them how much they thought that $5,000 gift was worth in their minds. Mom blinked at me. Dad's jaw tightened. I continued, asking if they thought $5,000 entitled them to decide who lived in the house I'd spent 4 years paying for. The house where I paid the mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance, the utilities, the maintenance. Every month. Without fail. My brother finally found his voice, saying he didn't mean it like that. He just thought since we were family and he was struggling, maybe I could help out temporarily. I looked at him directly and asked how temporary. He stammered, said maybe 6 months, maybe a year, just until he figured things out. I'd heard this song before. My brother had been figuring things out since he was 19. He was now 29. A decade of figuring, with nothing figured. I told them I'd been helping. For years. I'd been helping plenty. The look of confusion on their faces would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. So I laid it out. Every detail. Every instance. Every dollar. I'd been paying for their cell phone plan for 3 years. All 4 lines. That was $200 a month. $2,400 a year. $7,200 over 3 years. Mom looked shocked. Dad shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't done. I'd replaced their water heater 18 months ago when it died. Cost me $3,800 because they didn't have savings and I didn't want Mom taking cold showers in winter. I'd fixed Dad's truck last year, new transmission. $4,200. I'd loaned my brother money for rent 7 times in the past 2 years. He'd promised to pay me back. I was still waiting. That was $6,300. I'd paid for Christmas for the family the last 3 years because Dad's retirement wasn't stretching as far as expected. That was about $1,500 each year. Another $4,500. I'd hired their roof to be repaired after that storm 2 years back. $8,000. They'd promised to pay me back when Dad's pension adjustment came through. It came through. They bought a new living room set instead. The math was simple. I'd put in almost $37,000 into helping this family over the past few years. That $5,000 housewarming gift, I'd repaid it 7 times over. And nobody had noticed. Nobody had said thank you after the first time. It had just become expected. Mom's eyes were filling with tears. She said she didn't realize, they didn't know I was keeping track. I told her I wasn't keeping track to hold it over them. I was keeping track because I had to budget. Because unlike everyone at this table, I lived within my means and planned for the future. And that planning had allowed me to help them. Repeatedly. Quietly. Without making them feel small about it. Dad said I was their son. Helping was what family did. I agreed. I asked him when the help was supposed to flow both directions. When was my brother going to help me? When were they going to help me? I'd asked Dad to help me install shelving in my garage 3 months ago. He'd said he was too busy. Too busy, but not too busy to ask me to fix his truck 3 weeks later. My brother said he'd help me move. Once. 6 years ago. And I'd bought him pizza and beer, which he'd considered generous payment at the time. That was his contribution to our fraternal relationship over the past half-decade. I stood up from the table. Mom begged me to sit down, to talk about this reasonably. I told her I was being perfectly reasonable. I'd been reasonable for years. But calling me out in the middle of family dinner, treating me like I was selfish for not wanting my chronically unemployed brother as a permanent house guest, suggesting that $5,000 bought them equity in my life decisions. That wasn't reasonable. I told them I was done. No more cell phone plan. They could get their own. No more emergency loans. No more surprise repairs on my dime. They wanted to treat my help like it was nothing? Fine. Now it would actually be nothing. My brother started panicking immediately. He blurted out that he couldn't afford his own phone plan. I told him to get a job that paid better. He said those jobs didn't exist. I told him my company was hiring for entry-level IT support. $42,000 a year with benefits. I'd mentioned it to him 4 months ago. He'd said it sounded boring. Dad's face was red now. He said I was being spiteful and cruel. I asked him if it was cruel when he nodded along with my brother's suggestion that I owed them access to my house. He went quiet. Mom was crying openly, saying she never meant to seem ungrateful. They appreciated everything. Couldn't we just forget this whole conversation happened? I told her we could absolutely forget it happened. Right after they apologized for ambushing me and acknowledged that I'd been carrying this family financially for years without complaint. The silence stretched. Dad's pride wouldn't let him apologize. I could see it in the set of his jaw. My brother looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. Mom just kept crying. I grabbed my coat from the rack by the door, told them to enjoy the rest of their dinner. Mom called after me, pleading. I didn't turn around. The drive home was surreal. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I'd never stood up to them like that. Never pushed back. I'd always been the good son, the responsible one, the fixer. And they'd taken it for granted until there was nothing left to take. Update 1. The next morning, I woke up to 47 text messages and 12 missed calls. Most were from Mom, begging me to reconsider, saying Dad was upset and my brother was beside himself. A few were from Dad, terse and angry, telling me I'd embarrassed them and I needed to apologize. 3 were from my brother, alternating between saying I'd overreacted and asking if I was serious about the IT job. I responded to my brother first, sent him the link to the job posting, told him if he actually applied and got an interview, I'd put in a good word. If he got the job and kept it for 6 months, we could talk about rebuilding our relationship. I didn't respond to my parents. By noon, Mom had shown up at my house. I watched through the window as she rang the doorbell 6 times before finally leaving. She looked smaller somehow. Older. Part of me felt guilty. The larger part felt relieved. Dad called that evening. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it, uncertain. He said they needed to talk about the phone bill because it was due in 5 days and they didn't have enough to cover 4 lines. I told him that wasn't my problem anymore. He asked how he was supposed to come up with $200. I suggested they cancel my brother's line since he wasn't contributing to the household anyway. Dad hung up. My brother called an hour later. He'd actually applied for the IT job. Sounded shocked about it himself. Asked if I really meant what I said about putting in a good word. I told him I'd never lied to him before. I wasn't starting now. But my recommendation would be based on merit. If he got the job and screwed around, that reflected on me. He went quiet, then said he understood. 3 days after the dinner, Mom called from a number I didn't recognize. She'd gotten her own phone plan, just her and Dad. It was $130 a month through some discount carrier. She sounded exhausted. Said my brother had moved back in with them because he couldn't make rent without the money he'd been planning to save by living with me rent-free. That stung, knowing he'd assumed I'd just say yes, that he'd already spent money he didn't have based on an assumption of my generosity. She asked if I was really never going to help them again. I told her I didn't say never. I said I was done being taken for granted. There was a difference. If they had a genuine emergency and asked respectfully, I'd consider it. But the days of automatic yes, of fixing every problem while my own needs went ignored, those were over. She cried, told me she'd raised me better than this. I told her she'd raised me to be responsible and self-sufficient, and I was being exactly that. She'd also raised me to respect myself, even if she'd forgotten that part. She hung up without saying goodbye. Update 2. 2 weeks later, my brother called. He'd gotten an interview. Sounded terrified. Asked if I had any advice. I spent an hour on the phone with him, walking through common interview questions, explaining what the company culture was like, telling him how to position his scattered work history as diverse experience rather than instability. He thanked me quietly before hanging up. He got the job. Started the following Monday. Called me that evening, exhausted, saying it was harder than he expected, but the people seemed decent. I told him the first month was always the hardest. Stick with it. Mom and Dad's roof started leaking. Mom called, voice small, asking if I knew any contractors. Not asking me to pay for it, just asking for a reference. I gave her 3 names and told her to mention she was my mother. They'd probably give her a fair price. She thanked me, said she missed me at Sunday dinners. I told her I missed them too, but I wasn't ready yet. My brother made it a month at the job, then 2 months. Started calling me occasionally with technical questions, which I answered. Never asked me for money. At 3 months, he showed up at my house on a Saturday morning with $200 in cash. Said it was partial payment on what he owed me. I almost didn't take it. But the look on his face, pride mixed with nervousness, made me accept it. Told him to keep working at it, both the job and the payments. He nodded and left. Dad's truck broke down again. He called a mechanic himself this time. Paid for it with a credit card. Called me afterward, not to ask for help, but to complain about the cost. I sympathized. Told him that's what emergency funds were for. He grumbled something about not all of us being made of money. I let it slide. At 4 months, my brother invited me to coffee. Said he wanted to talk. We met at the shop where he used to work. His former manager saw him. Looked surprised he was wearing business casual instead of an apron. My brother introduced me as his brother who'd helped him get his current job. The pride in his voice was new. Over coffee, he apologized. Really apologized. Said he'd been a spoiled brat for most of his adult life, skating by on excuses and other people's generosity. Said the IT job was kicking his ass, but he was learning things, building skills, seeing a future for the first time in years. Said he understood now why I'd snapped. He'd have snapped too, probably sooner. He handed me another $300. Said he was trying to pay me back $50 to $100 every week, depending on overtime. At this rate, he'd have me paid back in a little over a year. I told him I appreciated it, but more than the money, I appreciated him getting his life together. He nodded, eyes a bit wet. Said Mom and Dad were struggling without my help, but they were figuring it out. Said Dad had actually cooked dinner twice last week because Mom picked up a part-time job at the library. That surprised me. I asked why Mom was working. My brother said they'd done the math and realized how much they'd been depending on me. Dad's pension and Social Security weren't enough to maintain their lifestyle, not without my subsidies. Mom working 20 hours a week at the library brought in enough to cover the gap. She actually seemed happier, my brother said. Like she had purpose again. Update 3. 6 months after that dinner, I accepted an invitation to Sunday brunch. Walked into my parents' house with my stomach in knots. The living room furniture looked the same. The roof no longer leaked. They'd scraped together the money for repairs. Mom hugged me at the door, holding on longer than usual. Dad shook my hand, which felt formal and strange, but his eyes were softer than I remembered. My brother was already there, looking healthier than he had in years. He'd been promoted at work. Junior technician to full technician. Small step, but forward momentum. He'd paid me back $4,200 of the $6,300 he owed. I'd stopped keeping close track, but he hadn't. Over brunch, we talked carefully around the elephant in the room until Dad finally addressed it. Said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. Said he'd been wrong to nod along when my brother suggested I owed him housing. Wrong to take my help for granted. Said he'd grown up in a generation where family helped family without question, but he'd never considered whether the help was flowing fairly. Said watching Mom take a job at 71 because they'd budgeted based on my assistance rather than their actual income had been humbling. Mom added that she'd always seen me as so capable, so together, that she'd forgotten I might need support too. Said asking for contractor references instead of assuming I'd pay for repairs had forced her to realize how much she'd stopped seeing me as a person with limits. Said her library job had reconnected her with a part of herself she'd lost in retirement. She'd made friends, felt useful, wished she'd done it sooner for reasons beyond money. My brother said his piece too. Said watching me cut them off had terrified him because he'd suddenly seen his future without his built-in safety net. Said that terror had been the kick he needed. Said he'd always known he was screwing up, but never felt consequences before. Everyone always caught him. Until I didn't. I accepted their apologies. Told them I'd never wanted to cut them out forever, just needed them to see me clearly. Needed respect, not just love. Needed partnership, not just obligation. We established new boundaries that day. Sunday dinners resumed, but everyone contributed. Cooking, costs, time. If someone needed help, they asked explicitly rather than hinting or assuming. If someone said no, that was respected without guilt. My brother continued his payment plan without me pushing. Dad started budgeting properly. Mom kept her library job because she enjoyed it. Things weren't perfect. Old habits resurfaced occasionally. Mom would hint about needing something, then catch herself and ask directly. Dad would start to get defensive when told no, then back down and accept it. My brother sometimes slipped into complaint mode about work before remembering he was lucky to have a job he was good at. But we were better, healthier, more honest. A year after that disastrous dinner, my brother made his final payment. Handed me a check for the remaining balance plus an extra $100. Said the extra was interest for being patient. I ripped up the check and handed him back the $100. Told him keeping the job, building his life, respecting boundaries, that was interest enough. He tried to argue. I insisted. We compromised on him buying dinner. At that dinner, he told me he was moving out of Mom and Dad's place. Had enough saved for first, last, and security on a modest apartment. Asked if I wanted to help him move. I agreed. He'd learned that asking directly worked better than assuming. My parents are stable now. Not wealthy, but managing. They're proud of managing. Dad brags about fixing things himself. Mom talks about her library patrons like their family. They ask about my life with genuine interest rather than looking for gaps where they might need me to step in. Last month, my furnace died. Cost me $4,000 to replace. I mentioned it at Sunday dinner, just making conversation. Dad offered to loan me $1,000 if I needed it. Mom said she could chip in $500 from her library earnings. My brother offered $300 from his emergency fund, which I knew he'd worked hard to build. I thanked them and told them I had it covered, but the offers meant everything. For the first time in years, maybe ever, help was offered to flow toward me. They saw me struggling with something and instinctively reached out. Not because they owed me, because they loved me and valued me. That's what I'd wanted all along. Not repayment, not groveling, just to be seen as someone who might occasionally need support instead of an endless well of resources. We're family. That means something again. Something balanced and mutual and real. It took burning everything down to rebuild it properly, but sometimes that's what foundation repair requires. I put down my fork at that dinner and changed everything. Best decision I ever made.